The silence during the drive wasn't new. It was the kind that had become normal between Cassie and me, like background noise we no longer noticed. We used to fill long road trips with playlists and podcasts or dumb games about spotting license plates. But this time we just didn't. I kept both hands on the wheel, watching the highway bend around pine forests and hills. Cassie sat with her legs tucked under her, scrolling through her phone, occasionally sighing like she wanted me to ask what was wrong, but never actually saying it. We were on our way to a couple's retreat, tucked away on the Oregon coast. Cassie had found it online, some wellness center that promised emotional clarity and relationship renewal. She booked it 2 months ago after our third blowout fight in as many weeks, the kind of fight that ends with both people sleeping in separate beds, not out of spite but because there's nothing left to say. At the time, I agreed just to avoid another argument. But sitting behind the wheel, it already felt like a lost cause. When we arrived, the place looked peaceful. Too peaceful. Like one of those stock photos of serenity you'd see on a meditation app. Rows of cedar cabins lined a gravel path. You could hear the ocean crashing in the distance. Birds chirped, trees swayed, and the air smelled like salt and pine. If I'd been alone, I might have actually relaxed. We checked in without much conversation. Cassie did the talking while I stood beside her, nodding at the receptionist like a mannequin. She had this way of slipping into performance mode around strangers, friendly, upbeat, like we were just another cute couple doing cute couple things. I'd gotten used to it. She wore masks the way other people wore shoes, one for every occasion. Our cabin was nice enough. Big windows, a gas fireplace, a queen-sized bed with pillows that didn't quite feel like ours. We dropped our bags and Cassie freshened up in the bathroom. I took the chance to collapse onto the bed and let my eyes rest. The drive had left a knot in my shoulders. "Hey, I'm heading to the coordinator meeting," she called through the door. "Back in an hour." I grunted some version of okay, but I don't think she heard me. A few minutes later, I heard the cabin door close. I lay there a while, staring at the ceiling fan slowly turning above me. The room was quiet. Too quiet. Eventually, I sat up and glanced around. Her phone was buzzing on the dresser, lighting up with a message. And that's when I made a choice. I stood, walked over, and picked it up. Cassie had always been cagey about her phone. She'd tilt the screen away from me when she texted or take calls in the bathroom. A few months ago, I joked about swapping phones for a day and she got weirdly defensive, said something about boundaries and trust. But now, standing there alone in that cabin, I wasn't thinking about boundaries. I was thinking about the numb pit in my gut and the way her tone had changed lately when she said, "I love you." Like it was something she remembered to say, not something she felt. The message was from someone named Trey. I didn't know a Trey. There was a photo. My stomach dropped before I even opened it. Cassie was sitting on a man's lap, her boss, if the rumors were true. It looked like the office party she mentioned a few weeks back, the one I was welcome to come to, but that she swore would be boring. He had his arm around her waist, hand resting way too high on her hip. She was leaning into him, laughing at something, wearing that red dress she only brought out for events where she wanted to be noticed. The caption read, "Best seat in the house, winking face." I just stood there, holding her phone, feeling like someone had unplugged me. My heartbeat was a dull echo in my ears. I didn't even notice how tightly I was gripping the device until I almost dropped it. I put the phone back exactly where it had been, like I hadn't touched it, like I could erase what I'd just seen. She came back about 45 minutes later, all smiles, talking about some group orientation and how the couple leading it had been through hell and back and now ran trust-building workshops. I just nodded and pretended to listen. I waited until we were sitting outside the cabin that evening, watching the sun disappear into the ocean before I brought it up. "You get any interesting messages today?" I asked casually. She furrowed her brow, then shrugged. "Nothing important." "Why?" I shrugged back. "Just wondering." She didn't press, but I saw it, the flicker of awareness behind her eyes. She knew I knew something. Later, when we were brushing our teeth in silence, I asked about the photo. "What photo?" she said, not even turning to face me. I told her I saw it. "The office party." Her on Trey's lap. She laughed like it was nothing. "Oh my God, that was just a stupid moment. People were drunk. Trey's harmless. We were all being silly." I looked at her through the mirror. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't ashamed. She looked irritated. Like I was the one causing a problem by bringing it up. "He's your boss, Cass." And she said, wiping her mouth, "It's not a big deal. Don't be dramatic." I wanted to push further. I wanted to say everything I was feeling, that I'd been suspicious for months, that I didn't recognize her anymore, that every time she pulled away from me in bed, I felt like I was living with a stranger. But I didn't. I swallowed it. I nodded and let her rewrite the moment into something harmless. But something shifted in me that night. There's a moment when a crack appears in glass, it doesn't shatter right away. It just splinters quietly. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. No matter how much you tell yourself the window's still holding, that it's fine, it's already broken. Just waiting for the right pressure to finish the job. That's what that night felt like. A hairline fracture in the foundation of everything I had convinced myself was still intact. I didn't scream. I didn't accuse. I just watched her crawl into bed beside me, oblivious or indifferent, and I stared at the ceiling while the waves crashed outside our window. I didn't know it yet, but the retreat had already begun *N with a crack I couldn't ignore. It's strange how your brain stores little things, odd glances, offhand comments, inconsistencies, and tucks them away until the right moment pulls them all into focus. After that night in the cabin, after that photo, I couldn't stop the flood. It was like a mental reel had started rolling, and every frame was some sign I had ignored. Cassie had been coming home later and later over the past year. Always something: last-minute meetings, client emergencies, networking mixers. At first, I believed her. I wanted to believe her. She'd gotten a promotion and was working under that same boss, the one from the photo. Demanding but brilliant, she called him. I thought it was a career milestone for her, and I was proud. I remember even buying champagne when she got the title change. But somewhere along the way, the excuses started sounding rehearsed. She'd get defensive when I asked simple questions like, "What time do you think you'll be home?" That used to be normal talk between us. Now it felt like I was stepping on a landmine. And then there were the nights she didn't come home at all. There was one in particular. It was winter. She said she had a corporate retreat just one night, an hour out of town. I didn't ask many questions. She left in a rush, throwing clothes into a suitcase and barely kissing me goodbye. But I remember waking up at 3 a.m. and checking my phone out of habit. I texted her around midnight to see if she'd made it to the hotel. No reply. I sent another. Nothing. She finally responded at 6:14 a.m., just 2 words, "All good." I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe she fell asleep early. Maybe the service was bad. But I also remember the guilt in her voice when she got back. Like she was overcompensating. She brought home a travel mug from the hotel with their logo, like proof. But even then, something in me didn't feel right. I'd smelled cologne on her once, not mine. Something musky and expensive. When I pointed it out, she laughed and said it was probably from a coworker hugging her goodbye. I didn't question it then. I actually remember being embarrassed that I had even brought it up. She had that way of making me feel like I was the one with the problem, like I was paranoid. I'd walk away from those conversations thinking I had overreacted, that I needed to trust more. But it wasn't just the cologne. It was the way she started hiding her phone, never left it face up, never plugged it in where I could see the screen. Notifications were always off. I once joked, "Who are you hiding from?" She smiled without making eye contact and said, "Just trying to be more present." I wanted to believe that. I really did. But I kept thinking about how she used to share everything with me: photos from her day, little texts during lunch, even venting about coworkers. Now it was like I didn't exist in that part of her life anymore. Her work became the sealed-off world I wasn't allowed to ask about. And that wasn't the only thing she'd changed. Out of nowhere, she got really into fitness. Signed up for some boutique gym across town. Started going every morning before work. Bought expensive gear, hired a personal trainer she talked about all the time, but whom I never met. She became obsessed with her image, spending more time in front of the mirror than she ever had. Her hair, her nails, her wardrobe, it all changed. She used to tease people who lived like that. But now it was her new personality. I didn't see it clearly back then. I thought maybe she was just trying to feel better about herself. Maybe it was harmless. But now at this retreat, replaying it all, the dots were connecting. On the second day of the program, we were asked to journal about our unspoken resentments. We sat in this open-air lodge, surrounded by other couples scribbling in silence, a crackling fire at the center. I stared at the page for a long time, pen in hand, wondering what I could possibly write that wouldn't explode everything. I thought about the time I planned a weekend trip for us last fall. I booked a cabin in Mount Hood, picked hiking trails I knew she'd love, even called her favorite winery ahead to schedule a tasting. She bailed the day before, said she couldn't miss a quarterly meeting. I ended up going alone. I remember sitting in the cabin that night, drinking wine by myself, telling myself it was okay. That she was just stressed. That next time would be different. There was never a next time. And still, I protected her. I made excuses for her to our friends, to my family. She's just busy. Her job is intense right now. We're good, just a rough patch. But now that I'd seen that photo, something broke. The excuses didn't hold anymore. They were tissue paper trying to hold back a flood. Cassie noticed the shift. That night she asked me what was wrong. She did it gently, like someone offering food to a skittish animal. Her tone was soft, but her eyes were watching me closely. "Zach, talk to me," she said. "You've been weird since we got here." I almost laughed. Weird. Distant. Cold. I didn't know what to say. What I wanted was to scream, "You're sitting here pretending like nothing's wrong while I'm barely holding it together." But instead I said, "Just tired." She didn't believe me. I could see it. She reached for my hand. Hers was warm. Familiar. And yet I flinched. Not because I hated her, but because I no longer knew who I was touching. I spent that night walking the grounds after she fell asleep. The moon was high over the trees and the air was sharp. I passed other cabins, saw couples through windows holding each other, reading together, laughing. I felt like a ghost moving through someone else's life. I sat on a bench overlooking the water, listening to the waves break against the cliffs, and tried to remember the last time Cassie and I were really happy. Not performatively happy, smiling for pictures, saying the right things in front of people, but real. Deep. The kind of happy that anchors you. I couldn't remember. And then a question hit me, cold and clear. What have I been holding on to? Was it the idea of our marriage, or the reality of it? Because the reality had become a mosaic of emotional distance, evasion, and manufactured in * Macy. Somewhere along the line, I had started measuring love by what I was willing to ignore. I stood and walked back to the cabin, feeling older than I had when I left. Cassie was curled up in bed, facing away from me. I slid in beside her and stared at the ceiling again, listening to her breathing. She shifted slightly, murmuring something I couldn't make out. I used to find comfort in her sleep sounds. Now I felt like a stranger in my own bed. And as I lay there, I realized something brutal and freeing at the same time. I had spent years trying to protect a version of us that only existed in my head. The real version, the one lying inches from me, wrapped in secrets and deflection, was already slipping away. The crack wasn't just in her phone or in the photo. It was in everything. And now that I'd seen it, I couldn't unsee it. On the third day, the retreat focused on honesty, how to practice it, how to hear it, how to survive it. The irony didn't escape me. That morning, during a guided group session, we all sat in a circle under a canopy of trees. The instructor, a woman with a kind voice and therapist eyes, asked each couple to talk about something they hadn't said out loud before. A truth they'd buried. When it was our turn, Cassie hesitated. She looked at me first, really looked at me for the first time since we'd arrived. Then she took a breath and said, "I haven't been fully honest with Zach." A few people shifted in their seats. My heart slowed, braced. "There's been someone else," she said. "Not physical, but emotional. I didn't mean for it to happen. We work together. We talk a lot. And I started relying on him in ways I should have relied on Zach." She turned toward me then, searching for something in my face, sympathy, understanding, maybe forgiveness. I gave her nothing. The room was silent except for the birds overhead. The instructor nodded slowly. "Thank you for your honesty, Cassie," she said, her voice like velvet. "That's a big step." I didn't respond. Not then. Because I already knew. What Cassie hadn't said, the thing she was trying to soften, was that this wasn't just an emotional connection. I knew it. I felt it in my bones. You don't sit on a man's lap and send winking captions if it's just coffee chats and mutual respect. Still, I played along. I sat through the rest of the session. I nodded when prompted. I took deep breaths when instructed. I even squeezed her hand when the group practiced a forgiveness exercise. But inside, I was spinning. Later that afternoon, I went to the main lodge to review some of the retreat materials. There was a resource folder all couples had access to: schedules, activities, workshop outlines, even anonymous feedback forms. I flipped through pages absent-mindedly, looking for anything to distract myself. And that's when I noticed something I wasn't meant to see. The center had an internal video system, a security setup, they said, for safety, not surveillance. But one of the files, marked incorrectly on a public drive, was a short clip labeled with a timestamp from the night before. Curiosity, no suspicion, got the best of me. I clicked. It was grainy, black and white. The view was angled down a hallway between the guest cabins. Around 11:48 p.m., a figure slipped from one cabin and crept toward another. I recognized the gait immediately. Cassie, wearing her favorite gray hoodie and those checkered pajama pants. She knocked lightly, looking both ways first. A man opened the door, staff member. I'd seen him around, maybe early 30s, smug smile, always a little too casual with the guests. He ushered her in. The door closed. The timestamp kept ticking. Midnight passed. 1:03 a.m. 2:11 a.m. At 2:32 a.m., she finally emerged. Same hoodie, but now wearing his jacket over it. Her expression was unreadable. She didn't look guilty. She looked content, at ease. My hands were shaking as I closed the file. I didn't confront her. Not then. Not immediately. I needed time. Space. I needed to not explode in the middle of a retreat that was supposed to heal us. Instead, I went for a walk, if you can call pacing around the perimeter of a wooded property a walk. I needed to think, to breathe, to keep from unraveling. What bothered me most wasn't even the betrayal. It was how easy she made it look, how comfortable she seemed, how smoothly she transitioned back into our routine after returning to the cabin, climbing into bed beside me like nothing had happened, like I didn't matter, like she had already moved on in her mind. Later that night, back in our cabin, I watched her move around like everything was normal. She folded her yoga pants, refilled her water bottle, asked if I wanted to try the meditation app the center had recommended. I stared at her, wondering how long she'd been doing this, how many nights she'd slipped away while I slept, how many lies had been planted in those just need a walk or gonna go journal by the fire pit lines. I finally said something. Did you sleep well last night? I asked. She looked up, caught off guard. Yeah. Why? Just wondering. You were out pretty cold when I got up. She blinked. Really? I don't remember that. Must have been a deep sleep, I said, letting the words hang. She nodded, then went back to folding. But her hands slowed. She knew. She knew I knew something. Still, I didn't push further. Not yet. I wanted her to stew in it, to feel the weight of the silence she'd built between us. That night, I didn't touch her, didn't kiss her goodnight. I turned to face the wall and stared into the darkness, thinking about how much I'd tolerated, how much I'd let slide. I thought about our wedding day, how she looked walking down the aisle, how I'd cried when I read my vows, how I promised to be her rock, her shelter, her home. I kept my promise. She hadn't. The next morning, the retreat coordinator asked if we'd like to join a couple's hike, supposedly good for rebuilding trust. I declined. Cassie looked at me, confused. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. Instead, I took the morning to myself. I walked to the cliff edge trail behind the center and stared out at the ocean. The wind whipped through my jacket. The horizon stretched endlessly, unbothered, indifferent. I thought about downloading that footage, about showing it to her, about asking her point blank, was it worth it? But I didn't, because I already knew the answer. She hadn't even admitted the full truth, and maybe she never would. Maybe in her mind, it was still just emotional. Maybe she convinced herself that sneaking into someone's cabin at midnight was somehow less damaging than confessing to what it actually was. But I wasn't stupid. I wasn't blind anymore. The betrayal was undeniable. The jacket, the hours spent away, the lie of omission. It all added up. She could paint it in soft colors, wrap it in careful language, but the picture was the same. She had left our marriage behind before she ever told me she was unhappy. And now, here we were, at a retreat designed to fix something that was already broken beyond repair. I didn't feel angry exactly. Not yet. What I felt was something colder, sharper, like clarity. I was done fighting to save something that she was actively destroying. I didn't know what came next. Not yet. But I knew I wasn't going back to who I was before. The man who kept swallowing red flags just to keep the peace. The man who mistook loyalty for silence. That man was gone. And in his place was someone ready to stop pretending. Something in me shifted after I watched that footage. Not in a dramatic, crashing kind of way, but like the slow turning of a tide. For the first time in a long time, I stopped blaming myself. I stopped rewriting her actions into something more digestible. And with that shift came something else, a quiet, stubborn refusal to keep participating in the fantasy. The retreat's fourth day focused on rebuilding trust through vulnerability. We were split into small groups, sat in circles, and asked to reenact common conflict dynamics. One person would play themselves, the other would play their partner. The idea was to see yourself through their eyes. Cassie volunteered us right away like she wanted to show how willing she was. How invested. She always liked being perceived as the one who tries. I'll be him, she said, sliding into my role with a smirk. She crossed her arms, furrowed her brow, and said, "Why don't you ever appreciate what I do? You just shut down. Every time something's wrong, you get quiet and mopey." There were a few chuckles in the group. Cassie went on. "And I'm supposed to guess what's bothering you? Like, maybe if you told me when you felt neglected, we wouldn't have these problems." I watched her, stunned not by what she said, but by how easily it rolled off her tongue. How rehearsed it felt. Like she'd told this story before, just not in front of me. In her version, I was the problem. The emotionally unavailable husband who made her feel unseen, unchosen. And maybe, to some degree, I had withdrawn. But the more she spoke, the more I realized she was setting the narrative before I could speak. When it was my turn to respond, I didn't play along. I didn't act like her. I didn't dramatize or mock. I just sat there for a moment, then said, "I feel like you've been building a version of me that's easier to blame. One that lets you feel justified in pulling away." Cassie blinked, caught off guard. I continued, my voice calm but deliberate. "I'm not perfect. I shut down sometimes, yeah? But not because I don't care. I shut down because every time I asked you what was going on, you'd lie. You made me feel like I was crazy for noticing the change. You told me nothing was wrong even as you were emotionally disappearing." The group went quiet. And when I finally started putting the pieces together, I added, "You minimized it. You called it harmless. Non-physical. You made it sound like a minor lapse in judgment instead of what it really was, a betrayal of the bond we spent years building." Cassie's face changed. Her mouth opened slightly as if to interrupt, but she didn't speak. She looked like someone who had just been caught mid-performance. I didn't yell. I didn't even raise my voice. But I saw how it landed. I saw the way a few people in the circle looked at her, then at me, with something like recognition. I didn't finish the exercise. I stood up and walked out. I needed air. Outside, the wind whipped through the trees. The sky was gray, the kind of gray that presses down on you. I stood under the overhang of the main lodge, hands in my pockets, staring at the gravel path. A few other participants were walking toward the dining hall, chatting softly. They nodded as they passed me like they weren't sure what to say but wanted to offer something. Later that evening, one of the other husbands, Tom, I think his name was, approached me while we were waiting in line for dinner. "I don't know if this means anything," he said, "but the way you spoke today, it hit home. Took guts to say that in front of everyone." I nodded, not sure what to say. But it did mean something. Because for the first time, someone had seen me. Not the passive husband Cassie painted, not the one too checked out to fight, but the man trying to hold something together that had already fallen apart. That night, Cassie tried to do damage control. She waited until we were back in the cabin, sitting across from me on the edge of the bed, elbows on her knees. "I didn't mean to make you look bad," she said. "That wasn't my intention." "No?" I asked. She sighed. "I was just trying to be honest." "Your version of honest," I said. "The one where everything's my fault and your decisions are just reactions to my flaws." "That's not fair." "No," I said, "what's not fair is rewriting our history so you can justify stepping outside of it." She didn't reply right away. She just stared at the floor, her fingers twisting the hem of her sleeve. "I felt invisible," she said finally. "For a long time. I needed someone to see me." I let the words settle. "I did see you," I said. "But you kept turning away." We sat in silence. Not the tense silence of the car ride here, but a different kind, resigned. Like we both knew we weren't arguing anymore. We were unraveling. The next day, I opted out of the morning's trust exercise. It involved blindfolds and being led around by your partner. I couldn't stomach the idea. When I told the coordinator, she gave me a disappointed smile and said, "Sometimes discomfort is necessary for healing." I nodded, but I didn't agree. Sometimes discomfort is just your body's way of saying no more. Instead of joining the group, I sat in a rocking chair on the lodge's wraparound porch. I watched as couples stumbled across the lawn in pairs, laughing nervously or barking orders. Cassie kept looking toward the porch as if she expected me to join in at the last second. I didn't. And in that chair, something shifted again. I realized I'd spent years performing, playing the part of the supportive husband, the silent partner, the forgiver, always minimizing my needs to keep the peace, always believing that if I just held on tighter, she'd meet me halfway. But that's not how love works. Love isn't supposed to be a performance. It's not supposed to be one person swallowing disappointment while the other chases their impulses. It's not supposed to feel like gasping for air in a room full of someone else's excuses. When the exercise ended, Cassie came up to the porch. She didn't say anything. Just stood there, looking at me like she wanted a cue. "I'm not doing this anymore," I said, my voice low. "Doing what?" "Playing along. Pretending we're okay." Pretending like this is fixable when you're not even willing to admit what you've really done. She sat down in the chair next to mine. I made mistakes, she said. But I want to fix it. I turned to her, calm but clear. You want to fix how it looks, not what it is. She didn't argue. Maybe because she knew I was right. Maybe because, for the first time, I wasn't giving her an easy out. That night, I requested my own room. The staff didn't ask questions. They just handed me a key and gave me a map. As I walked across the property with my overnight bag slung over my shoulder, I felt something strange, not guilt, not grief, not even anger, just stillness. The kind that comes when you finally stop carrying a burden that was never yours to begin with. My new cabin was smaller, quieter, and colder literally and otherwise. It smelled like cedar and detergent. The bed was firm, the walls were bare, and the silence wrapped around me like a weighted blanket. But for the first time in months, maybe years, I could breathe. That first night alone, I didn't sleep much. I sat on the floor with my back against the bed frame, just staring out the window at the fog rolling in from the coast. I kept waiting for regret to hit me, for some flood of second thoughts or panic to make me rush back to her. But it never came. Only clarity. In the morning, I skipped breakfast with the group and instead walked down to the beach trail. The tide was low. The sun broke through in pieces, the light bouncing off wet rocks like shattered glass. I walked the shoreline until my feet hurt and my head stopped spinning. By the time I returned, Cassie was waiting on the porch of the main lodge. She didn't look angry. She looked tired. The kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. Can we talk? She asked, folding her arms like she was bracing for wind. I nodded. We walked behind the building where a few benches overlooked the cliffs. The wind had picked up. Cassie pulled her sleeves over her hands like she was trying to shrink. I've been thinking a lot, she started, eyes fixed on the horizon. About why I do the things I do. I said nothing. Just waited. When I was 8, she continued, my mom caught my dad cheating. It wasn't the first time. She didn't leave him. She didn't even yell. She just disappeared inside herself. For years. I'd hear her crying through the wall, but she'd pretend everything was fine during the day. It messed me up. Her voice was flat, almost clinical, like she'd practiced saying it in therapy but wasn't sure how to make it real out loud. I remember thinking, I'll never be like her. I'll never be the one left behind. I'll never let anyone have that kind of power over me. She looked at me then. Her eyes weren't wet. They were guarded. Calculated. I think that's why I keep control in relationships. Why I test boundaries. She paused. Why I need attention. There it was. The closest thing to an admission I'd probably ever get. Not about what she did, but why she did it. I nodded slowly. You wanted to dominate before being dominated. She looked startled by the words, then nodded. Yeah, exactly. I let the silence stretch for a while. I wanted to understand her truly, I did. I wanted to believe there was some broken logic behind the betrayal. That maybe if I understood the wiring, I could make peace with the wreckage. But all it did was explain the pain. It didn't heal it. You know what the hardest part of all this is? I said finally. She shook her head. It's not the lies. Or even the cheating. It's realizing that I've spent the last few years loving someone who was playing a completely different game. She flinched like I'd struck a nerve. I thought we were building something real, I continued. And you, whether consciously or not, were making sure you always had the upper hand. You needed to know that if things fell apart, you wouldn't be the one begging. Her mouth opened, then closed. She didn't deny it. And I get it, I added. I get why that fear lives in you. But you *P***nized it. You used your past to justify destroying our present. Her lips trembled. For a second, I thought she might finally cry. But she just pressed them into a line. I'm not trying to make excuses, she said. I just wanted you to know it wasn't about you. That's the problem, Cass, I said. It was never about me. Not when you were texting him. Not when you walked to his cabin in the middle of the night. Not when you stood in front of that group and turned me into the villain to protect your image. That last part hit her. I saw it in her posture, the way her shoulders tensed, the way her fingers curled around the bench. I wasn't trying to paint you as the villain, she whispered. No? I asked. Then why was your version of me so small? So one-dimensional? Why was I the emotionally distant husband while you got to be the neglected wife with a harmless connection? She turned her face away, watching the ocean again. I don't know, she said. Maybe because I couldn't handle being the bad guy. Not completely. I sighed. Then maybe you shouldn't have done things that made you one. The wind picked up again. I pulled my jacket tighter around me. Cassie shivered next to me but didn't move. I think I always assumed you'd forgive me, she said, almost too quietly to hear. That if I just said the right things or explained myself enough, you'd come back. I didn't respond. Because part of me had once believed that love meant automatic forgiveness. That understanding someone's trauma meant excusing their damage. But I didn't believe that anymore. Understanding isn't the same as healing. And empathy isn't a bandage for betrayal. After a while, she stood. I should go. I have that afternoon session. I nodded, still staring at the waves. She waited for a second like she expected me to stop her. I didn't. Eventually, she walked away. When I returned to my cabin later that evening, I found a folded note under the door. It was written on the back of a retreat itinerary. It read, Zach, I know I've broken something that can't be easily fixed. I know I've lied, twisted, minimized. I see it now how much I've hurt you. How much I've used your silence to protect my guilt. I'm sorry for all of it. I don't know what I thought I was doing, but I can't escape it anymore. I just want you to know it was never about not loving you. It was about not knowing how to be loved without losing myself. Cassie. I sat with the note in my lap for a long time. The words were heavy, honest even, but they didn't change anything. They weren't a path forward. They were just a postscript. Because no matter how much I tried to see her pain, her brokenness, her history, I couldn't ignore mine anymore. She didn't just break a promise. She broke the story I had told myself for years. That we were a team. That we were building a future. That love could survive anything as long as you stayed. But some wounds aren't meant to be healed together. Some breaks show you where the foundation was weak all along. And maybe the real growth, the real healing comes not from forgiving the person who hurt you, but from finally forgiving yourself for staying as long as you did. The last full day of the retreat was reserved for what the facilitators called the ultimate trust exercise. We'd heard whispers about it all week, some version of the classic fall into your partner's arms activity, only with added layers. Eye contact, silence, vulnerability. By the time we gathered in the clearing where it would take place, most couples looked nervous but hopeful. Cassie and I stood near the edge of the group, a few feet apart. She hadn't said much that morning. Neither had I. There was nothing left to discuss, not really. When the instructions were given, stand facing away from your partner, close your eyes, fall back, trust they'll catch you, I didn't move. Cassie turned toward me, her eyes already glassy. I think she knew what was coming before I even said it. I'm not doing this, she whispered. I nodded. I figured. The facilitator approached gently. You two okay? We're fine, I said, meaning it in the only way that made sense now. She doesn't want to do it. Cassie looked down. It's not that I don't want to. I can't. I didn't argue. I didn't push. I simply stepped back, then lowered myself to the ground. While the others stood and leaned and caught each other, I knelt alone in the grass. Not in protest. Not for drama. Just because I needed a moment to mark it, that quiet, internal line that divides one life from the next. When it was over, Cassie stood silently beside me, but I didn't reach for her hand. Instead, I walked straight to the lodge, found the coordinator, and asked for my own room for the final night. It wasn't a declaration. It was a decision. That evening, I packed my things and moved my bag quietly. Cassie stood by the door as I zipped the suitcase, her arms wrapped around herself. Is this it? She asked, not accusing, just unsure. I looked at her, really looked at her. This woman I had shared years with, a home, a history, countless mornings and inside jokes and movie nights and fights and forgiveness. I think it's been it for a while, I said. And she didn't argue. The next morning I left before sunrise. The air was thick with mist and the gravel crunched under my boots as I walked to my car. I didn't leave a note. I didn't send a text. There was nothing to explain. Everything that needed to be said had already been said, mostly in silence. I didn't go home. Instead, I drove north. A small coastal town 3 hours up the road caught my eye. It wasn't remarkable. That's why I chose it. I found a modest rental near the water, nothing fancy, just a space that didn't carry memories. The first thing I bought was a used guitar from a thrift shop. I hadn't played in years, not since before Cassie and I got married. Music had been a part of me once, but like so many other pieces, I'd put it down to focus on being practical. Now, alone with no one to impress or disappoint, I let my fingers remember. The sound was rough at first, but it was mine. A few days later, Cassie messaged me. One long paragraph, no greeting, no signature. She accused me of emotionally abandoning her. Said my silence was cruel. Said I had checked out long before she ever looked elsewhere. I stared at the screen for a while. Not angry. Not hurt. Just tired. Then I deleted the message. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to defend myself. I didn't have to explain what she should have already known. I didn't owe anyone a rebuttal. My piece wasn't up for debate. In that quiet rental, with the sea air in my lungs and calluses slowly forming on my fingertips again, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, not excitement, but stillness. A steady kind of peace that didn't come from someone else's presence, but from my own. I wasn't broken. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't rebuilding for revenge. I was just becoming whole again. And that was enough.